Elizabeth felt much better and she unwound with a nice warm bath. One of her favourite things. Soon after Troy's murder, John, Elizabeth and the kids were on the move again. Same area, not too far away from where they were. The 3 barrels were a problem though. John considered it too risky to move them to the new place. So with the help of Robert Wagner, John moved the barrels to his mate Mark Hayden's place. They stored the barrels there in the garage. Also living with Mark Hayden was his partner, Elizabeth Sinclair, another person John Bunting hated. He hated her because she was overweight, and he thought that she was a bad mother, as most of her 7 children had been taken off her. He referred to her as slut when he found out that she had herpes. Elizabeth's sister Gail Sinclair also lived with them, as did Gail's teenage son, Fred Brooks. Fred had learning difficulties at school, but he was described as a genuinely nice kid who wouldn't hurt anyone. Gail Sinclair treated him like shit. John Bunting started hanging around often since his barrels were now stored in Mark's garage. He hated Elizabeth, but he was very flirty with her sister Gail. Although he hated Gail's son Fred. He hated him in part because he was the nephew of Elizabeth Sinclair, even though he was flirting with his mother, and in part because he considered him a pedophile. That was based on absolutely nothing, no evidence at all. It was now getting to the point where if John didn't like you, that made you a pedophile. It was the 17th of September 1998. Fred Brooks was now 18. He told his mum Gail that he was headed out to a party and he would be gone for the night. John Bunting and Robert Wagner were also there visiting Mark Hayden. Fred spoke to them out the front as he was leaving. 15 minutes after Fred had left, John, Robert and Mark told Gail they were heading off to do a job. Fred never made it back home the next day. Gail was worried, but John told her not to because he and Robert had seen him off his face on drugs. He was aggressive and in quite a rage, so it was best to let him stay away for a while. But when Gail still hadn't heard from Fred days later, she called the police and made a report. Fred never made his party. He was talked into helping John, Robert and Mark on what they said was going to be a break and enter into a computer warehouse. They promised Fred a nice new computer if he helped out. Fred could hardly control his excitement. He eagerly said yes. He was happy too when he heard Jamie was going to be there. He really liked Jamie. Fred met them at John's house, but they weren't going anywhere near a computer warehouse. They dragged him into the bathtub. He was also made to call his attackers Lord Sir, God, Master, and Chief Inspector. And just like Troy, they made Fred speak into the tape recorder. They made him say to his mum that he was leaving and to fuck off and never contact him again. They had formed the idea of making tape recordings to convince people their victims were still alive, after the call to Nicole impersonating Michael Gardner had failed to convince her. During the torture, John was screaming at Fred to confess he had touched up a young girl. Fred had no idea what John was talking about and denied it. But when the torture didn't stop, Fred said yes, he had touched up a young girl. Fred would say whatever they wanted to make it stop. After he made that admission, they started savagely attacking his groin area. They shoved sparklers into him, stubbed their cigarettes out on him, punched him, kicked him, crushed his toes with pliers. Fred started dropping in and out of consciousness. But finally, they put an end to it by strangling him. He was dismembered and put into a barrel. After killing her son, John went to Gail's house and slept with her that same night. A few days after making the missing persons report, Gail received a call from Fred. She was shocked at the abuse he hurled at her down the phone, but she was happy that he was alive. The tape recording had worked. She called the police to let them know the good news. Meanwhile, John, Robert and Jamie got a hold of Fred's welfare payments. Gary O'Dwyer was put up for adoption as soon as he was born in 1969. He was born with severe epilepsy. By age 15, Gary was off the rails, abusing alcohol and drugs. He drifted around the city of Adelaide. In 1994, he suffered brain damage after a hit-and-run accident. He received a substantial payout and he was able to move into a place of his own. He moved into a government housing house in Murray Bridge, just up the road from John Bunting. John hated Gary, called him a useless epileptic prick. It had only been a month since the murder of Fred Brooks, but John and Robert already had the urge to kill again. The tape recordings of their victims that John loved to listen to weren't cutting it anymore. They needed a new victim. They were killing because they enjoyed it, no other reason. Stealing their victims' welfare money was just an added bonus. John used Jamie to approach Gary to find out what he wanted to know. Gary was thrilled to get a visitor and invited Jamie inside. Gary thought Jamie seemed very nice and he showed a lot of interest, asking a lot of questions about him. Yes, he was on a disability pension. No, he doesn't have to lodge regular forms to get his pension. Yes, he lives on his own. No, he doesn't have a wife or kids or any other family. Another easy target for John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Jamie suggested bringing a few of his friends around one night, and Gary was excited by the idea. He would love to meet some new people. Jamie introduced Gary to his friends, John and Robert. They sat around chatting and had a few drinks, and eventually John nodded to Robert, who put Gary into a headlock and dragged him to the floor. After getting the PIN number for his bank card, they got their tape recorder out and forced Gary to say what they wanted. Mark Hayden also turned up and joined in a bit later on. Just like their other victims, they spent hours torturing him, and after the killing, they dismembered him and put him in a barrel. They then stole furniture out of his house. Not that anyone really cared, but some people around the area did mention that they hadn't seen Gary for a while. But John was quick to reassure them he was fine. He'd just been beaten up by somebody and they were still threatening him, so he had to leave town. Gary O'Dwyer was 29 years old. Not all of the victims were reported missing, but two that were eventually after time caught the interest of police: Barry Lane and Clinton Trezise. The police were interested because there was a common person that was linked to both of them: Robert Wagner, the former lover of Barry Lane and friend of Clinton Trezise. It was no secret that Barry and Robert's relationship was a violent one that ended with bad blood. And Clinton was a friend of both of them who only lived nearby. They looked into Barry's finances. His bank accounts were still active. His pension money was being withdrawn from the same service station each time. They set up video surveillance and saw that it was actually Robert Wagner who was withdrawing Barry's money. Requests for a full-blown investigation, including surveillance, to find out what was going on were denied, because police didn't have enough resources at the time. It was only a month after Gary O'Dwyer's murder that Mark Hayden was explaining to his brother-in-law how his partner Elizabeth Sinclair had left him after they had a big fight. Mark told his brother-in-law that he had no idea where she had taken off to. Mark and Elizabeth always fought with each other, often very violently, and not once had Elizabeth ever taken off. It wasn't in her character to run off and not tell anyone where she was. And what Mark Hayden failed to mention in his story was that Elizabeth Sinclair's disappearance coincided with the time that John Bunting found out she knew about Clinton Trezise, because Mark Hayden had told her. John didn't say too much when Mark confessed to him that Elizabeth knew. John just nodded. But behind Mark's back, John was furious. complaining that Mark had a big fucking mouth.